Inauspicious consequences he had foreseen, incidentally, but consequences which, when they came, in spite of his having foreseen them, were pretty painful to him. Consequences which covered both the human field, i.e. his regard for people who were being persecuted by the Nazis, and the artistic field, inasmuch as he couldn't always do what he wanted to do, and certainly quite often refused to do what he was told to do.
And he was terribly upset about the situation. But how should I say, his being upset was in a wrong direction. He was upset that a man like Bruno Walter could not conduct, was prevented from conducting, that a man like Arthur Schnabel, the great pianist, that a man like Bronislaw Huberman, and he would have done everything in his power to revoke those laws concerning those people, but not concerning a small, modest piano teacher in a conservatory or a violinist in a provincial orchestra.
Jascha Horenstein himself was dismissed as musical director of the Düsseldorf Opera by the Nazis in 1933.
I would like to say very emphatically that Furtwängler was not a Nazi. I have seen him in Vienna in May 1933, it means about 2 months after the Nazis took over. I saw him later in Paris, maybe 1 or 2 years later, and he definitely was not a Nazi. He used very strong language in a conversation with me in Vienna, very strong language against the regime. In saying so, I also would like to stress that it does not mean that I agree with his line of conduct. That is a different matter. He was a great musician, but he was a weak man.
I have often been asked why I remained in Germany at all, when I did not really have to. I could have emigrated at the time and been thought of as a martyr, and fought National Socialism from outside Germany. But I remained. Not because I had changed my views. I offered resistance where it was possible. I did not conduct in occupied countries, because I did not wish to appear in the wake of tanks and guns. My view was and is that art must have no truck with power politics, war and hatred between nations.
In fact, a major difference of opinion arose between Furtwängler and the Nazis in November 1934, when he wrote an article for a German Sunday paper in support of Paul Hindemith, whose compositions had been banned in Germany. This caused a great uproar, and as a result, Furtwängler resigned all his appointments and left Berlin for the Bavarian mountains, where at last he was able to take up composition again. But in spite of the Nazi acts of oppression and suppression, he couldn't stay away from Berlin and its musical life. And within months, he'd made an agreement to acknowledge Hitler and his ministers as solely responsible for cultural policies, in exchange for an assurance that he himself would be free to follow his own musical policies and be independent of politics. This was the only way Furtwängler could continue conducting in Germany. But there were wide disagreements about his decision, and many who thought him a traitor. In the event, it proved not possible to remain independent of politics. In spite of his many acts of resistance to the regime, he was frequently used for propaganda purposes. And in 1942, he was maneuvered into conducting for Hitler's birthday concert. But meanwhile, in March 1937, his first violin sonata had been given its first performance. And later in the same year, the symphonic piano concerto was first heard, with Edwin Fischer as soloist. This rarely heard work was performed in 1965 in Berlin's new Philharmonic Hall by Zubin Mehta, with Daniel Barenboim as soloist.
even though he had great knowledge of music and of how music should be played, there was always an element of improvisation, an element of surprise in the harmonies and in everything that had to do with the music. And it was this kind of conscious naivety that allowed him to understand the music of Beethoven and Brahms and Bruckner and so on so well. And I think this is also what comes through very much in his music. I'll play now a few bars from the cadenza at the end of the first movement.
With the war, concert life in all cities suffered from air raids and travel difficulties. It was a period of concern about the continued existence of the orchestra. Many of its younger members were called up. It was also a period of makeshift halls, of blackouts and air raids, of interrupted performances, of concerts for the wounded and for the workers.
At first I was able to go on working, but gradually difficulties were piling up. I was able, it is true, to remain unaffected in my private sphere. My orchestra too remained intact and kept its full strength at first. But I could not prevent an inexorable change taking place in the musical life. More and more obstacles were being put in my way.
But the more outrageously the Nazis behaved, the more outspoken were Furtwängler's public comments. And in February 1945, he was warned that he was about to be arrested. But he escaped just in time to Switzerland with his son and his second wife, Frau Elisabeth Furtwängler.
In 1945, we lived in Clarens on the Lake of Geneva without money. but Swiss music lovers helped us till 1947. In one way, it was a hard time because we had no news from our family in Germany or only bad news. But on the other hand, for Furtwängler, it was a big chance. For once he had time for his compositions. So he finished his first symphony, and on the other hand, he adored the mountains and the lake, and it was a big consolation for him to walk in the nature.
In December 1946, 18 months after the end of the war, proceedings took place in Berlin to clear Furtwängler of charges of having supported the Nazi regime. The courtroom was crowded with press photographers, cameramen, journalists. At the second hearing, he was cleared, but months passed before the findings were confirmed by the Allied authorities. Among those who spoke up for Furtwängler was Boleslav Barlock, who's well known as director of the Berlin Schiller Theater.
I wrote in a Berlin newspaper at the time, it should be stated here that Furtwängler was one of the few great German artists whose open and vigorous resistance to the Nazis had come to my knowledge. Have those who now criticize Furtwängler never heard of the fact that as late as 1935 he conducted Mendelssohn in public in Berlin? That he rejected presents from Hitler in the shape of an annual pension of 100,000 marks, of a house and a baronial estate? That he refused to give the Hitler salute? Furtwängler was attached to Berlin, attached to Germany, attached to his Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. He thought he'd be able to do much more to keep the anti-civilization of the Nazi period from prevailing completely in Germany.
In May 1947, Furtwängler made his first appearance in Berlin as a conductor after a gap of over 2 years. Berliners queued up for tickets all night long. The lady at the box office of the Titania Palace received some very strange and rather touching offers. There were those who brought Meissen porcelain figures or leather shoes, almost new, because they had no money. Again, others thought that the currency of those days, cigarettes, might secure tickets even after the stickers saying "House Full" were up. From Whitsun 1947, Furtwängler began to conduct regularly in Berlin, and soon the Berlin Philharmonic was able to go on tour again. At a time when Germany possessed neither respect nor diplomatic missions abroad, Furtwängler and the orchestra became ambassadors of music. Furtwängler was renowned for his interpretations of Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert, Wagner. For the composers of his own day, on the other hand, he appeared to have less sympathy.
It is true to say that he had a certain amount of hostility towards 12-tone music. Hostility which he harbored in spite of the fact that he thought it his duty to give the first performance of Schoenberg's orchestral variations, Opus 31, which are a 12-tone work. He thought this his duty because he smelled that there was great music there, in spite of his hostility to the technique.
One had the impression that he understood and respected the newer works, I am not quite sure whether he loved them wholeheartedly.
He regretted that so great a musician as Schoenberg, the greatest musician he personally had ever come across, could be so far misled by what he thought were Schoenberg's theories as to deny the biological source of music, which to him was key, and do things which could not ever eventually be successful.
The essential thing is what I hear, what comes from the music. A theme, a melodic line, a counterpoint which I cannot perceive clearly and distinctly by the ear alone has no existence for me. My opinion is that the artist's task is a sensualization of the spiritual as much as the spiritualization of sensuality.